All right, this screencast is to cover Rnk Strategists, which you probably read about regarding succession. Now, Rnk Strategist isn't limited to succession. It's just talking about strategies that species use to be successful in their environment, having to do with their reproduction rate, their parental care, how quickly they mature. So the reason why they get the names Rnk Strategists has to do with the population growth curve. You see that the R strategist, like a cockroach, is one that is around its biotic potential. It grows more exponentially. It kind of has that boom and bust cycle for exponential growth. And these species tend to have lots and lots of offspring, reproduce very quickly, have short lifespans. Whereas the K-selected species, it's called that because their populations tend to hang out around carrying capacity. So they tend to be longer lived. They have fewer offspring, have more parental care. They mature slowly. These are all factors actually that you need to be able to discuss when you're talking about these two types of species. There's a list here that you can go back and look at in the PowerPoint, just talking about some of their strategies that make them successful and some examples. So you see that they tend to have a lot of offspring in R-selected versus fewer offspring in K-selected. In R-selected, there's usually little to no parental care versus high parental care and protection of offspring. This early reproductive age versus later reproductive age is important in how quickly they can reproduce. If they can start reproducing at a much younger age, generally they can have more babies in their lifetime, whereas that later reproductive age tends to put off reproduction until their later years, and it means that they can have fewer within their lifetime. And you can see these tend to be short-lived, where many of these tend to live to reproductive age. That high population growth rate, they tend to be around R versus the lower population growth rate keeps them usually fairly stable around carrying capacity. And so this last bit here is why they are added into this succession unit, is because generally in the early successional stages, like the pioneer stages, you tend to see a lot of R strategists, dandelions, fireweed, species that can move in pretty quickly, take advantage of new resources coming along. But they tend to boom and bust. Because as the successional stages start to develop, they cannot compete as well as some of the longer-lived K-selected species. So these species have a much higher ability to compete. They tend to be able to dominate once those successional stages are further along and have more resources to survive. So we tend to see these guys taking over in a pioneer, and we tend to see these guys in more of a late successional stage or a climax community. You might also see survivorship curves kind of related to Rnk selected species. What these survivorship curves are is they are showing a cohort of individuals going from birth until their maximum of their lifespan, how many of them tend to survive. So this would be, for humans, this would be 0 when you're born, and then human lifespan somewhere 80 to 100 years, right? And then, so if you were looking at us, this type 1 late loss, most of the offspring compared to other species tend to live until reproductive age and adulthood, and not until they're later along do they tend to start to see a significant drop in their survivorship. So a type 1 survivorship curve is something like a large mammal, something that's a K-selected species. Whereas the R-selected species tend to have this type 3 survivorship curve. A lot of offspring are born, but many of them die very quickly right away because there's not a lot of parental care. And so they have early loss. Then the ones that do survive can usually make it out to the remaining of their lifespan. Lastly, there's this type 2 constant loss that can be like small mammals and songbirds, where in some cases it doesn't really matter how old they are, because they're prey species, they tend to get picked off at any age. You can go and kind of look at all the details in the PowerPoint about these different survivorship curves. So you can see the type 1 tends to be longer lived species, K-selected, mortality early, low in life, and it increases in old age. Where that type 2 is that constant mortality. You're seeing like mice and songbirds. They tend to suffer from predation. And then lastly, the type 3 survivorship curves, anything that has those population losses really early in life has lots of babies, like the cockroaches. They are selected species without a lot of parental care to protect them.